Me.
I know you're all busy teachers,
Always.
always looking for ways to bring more critical thinking into your math classrooms, right?
Absolutely. A constant quest for all of us.
Well, get ready because we're about to unpack Chapter 12 of Building Thinking Classrooms in Mathematics.
Ooh, exciting.
And trust me, this chapter is like a cheat sheet for transforming how you evaluate your students.
It really is. It gets to the heart of it,
Yeah.
aligning those assessments with what we truly value, those higher order thinking skills that go beyond just rote memorization.
Right. It's about moving past those fill-in-the-blank tests and really getting into how students think, how they problem solve, how they collaborate.
Totally.
This chapter starts with a question that really got me thinking. What are the most important competencies you look for in your students?
Yeah, such a good question. And it's fascinating when the author posed that question to teachers.
Wow.
Across different grade levels, even subjects, the same three competencies consistently rose to the top.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
Perseverance, willingness to collaborate, and the ability to take risks.
Interesting, but also makes total sense when you think about it.
Right.
It's not just about getting the right answer. It's about how students approach the learning process itself.
Absolutely.
Did you say that's a fair assessment?
Absolutely. And the chapter goes on to argue that our traditional evaluation methods sometimes clash with that goal of cultivating these skills.
Oh, that's interesting.
Think about it, a standardized test
Yeah.
doesn't exactly reward a student for taking risks or trying a new approach, does it?
That's a really good point. In fact, it often feels like those kinds of assessments encourage the opposite,
Yeah.
just memorizing formulas and procedures. So where do we go from here?
Right.
How do we actually measure these more complex competencies?
Well, the chapter dives deep into the world of rubrics
Okay.
as a tool for assessing these skills,
I like it.
but not the traditional rubrics we're all used to.
Okay.
The author starts by dissecting a typical four-column rubric, like the one shown in Figure 12.1, and highlights its shortcomings.
Yeah, I've definitely used those rubrics before. The ones with exceeds expectations, meets expectations, and so on. They seem straightforward,
Right.
but I can see how they might miss the nuance of what we're trying to measure here.
Exactly. One of the key issues is that those rigid categories can actually hinder student growth.
Oh, interesting.
Instead of seeing progress as a continuum, students get fixated on fitting into a specific box.
Yeah.
It becomes about achieving a label, not developing skills.
So the rubric, which is meant to be a guide for improvement, ends up becoming a barrier.
It is, and what's even more concerning is the observation that teachers were spending more time analyzing the rubric itself
Oh, wow.
than providing meaningful feedback to students. The tool designed to support assessment was getting in the way of real learning.
Okay, so if those traditional rubrics aren't cutting it, what's the alternative? How do we design rubrics that actually support the development of these critical thinking skills we're talking about?
This is where things get really interesting. The chapter proposes a radical shift, co-constructing rubrics with students.
Hold on, co-creating rubrics with students.
Yes.
That's a new one for me. I have to admit, I'm a little skeptical, but also very intrigued.
I understand.
What does that even look like in practice?
Imagine you're in your classroom.
Okay.
Instead of handing out a pre-made rubric, you start a conversation with your students
Uh-huh.
about what good looks like for a particular competency.
Okay, I'm picturing it, but I'm still not quite sure how that translates into a usable rubric.
Well, the chapter walks us through a simple yet powerful tool for facilitating this process, the T-chart.
Ah, the trusty T-chart.
Oh, yeah.
I love using those with my students. They're so versatile.
Exactly. So you'd set up your T-chart with two columns, one for good and one for not so good, or needs improvement.
Okay.
Then as a class, you brainstorm what those behaviors look like for the chosen competency. Let's say you're focusing on perseverance.
Okay, so for good perseverance, students might say things like, keeps trying even when it's hard, or asks for help when they're stuck.
Precisely, and for the needs improvement side, they might suggest things like gives up easily or gets frustrated and stops working.
I'm already seeing how powerful this could be just by having that discussion and putting those ideas down on paper.
Right.
You're making those abstract concepts much more concrete for students.
And that's just the first step. The real magic happens when you take those student-generated ideas and transform them into a visual rubric. So we left off talking about that T-chart, right?
Right, and I'm really starting to see how involving the students in this process makes a huge difference.
Yeah.
It's not just a list of rules handed down from on high.
Right.
It's something they've helped create, so they're more invested in it.
Exactly. And the chapter emphasizes that this isn't about, being punitive or judgmental.
Right.
It's about creating that shared language and understanding of what we're all striving for.
So it's less about you're doing it wrong and more about here's what we can all work towards together.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got our T-chart filled with all these great student insights. What's the next step in turning this into an actual rubric?
This is where we tap into the power of visuals.
Okay.
The chapter recommends keeping the rubric simple, using clear images and minimal text.
Because let's face it, even for us adults, a big wall of text can be intimidating, let alone for our students.
Yeah.
So how do we make these rubrics visually engaging and easy to understand?
Well, remember all those great phrases the students came up with
Yeah.
during that brainstorming session?
Uh-huh.
We can use those as a starting point.
Okay.
For example, if a good perseverance behavior is trying different strategies, maybe you draw a picture of a student using different tools or manipulatives to solve a problem.
I love that. And for giving up easily. Maybe it's a student slumped over their desk with a frustrated expression. You
Well,
know, that classic I give up pose.
exactly. The goal is to create a rubric that's instantly recognizable and relatable to your students, no matter their age or reading level.
I'm starting to get really excited about trying this in my own classroom. It feels so much more empowering
Yeah.
than just handing out a pre-made rubric that might not even resonate with my students.
And that sense of ownership is key. When students feel like they've had a voice in creating those assessment criteria, they're more likely to take it seriously and strive to meet those expectations.
It makes sense, but I also have to admit, I'm a little nervous about actually implementing this.
Sure.
What if my students come up with too many ideas? Or what if their suggestions aren't very insightful?
Those are valid concerns, and the chapter addresses those head on. Remember, you're the facilitator in this process.
Okay.
Your role is to guide the discussion, keep it focused, and help students refine their thinking.
So if they start going off on tangents or suggesting things that aren't really relevant to the competency, I can gently steer them back on course.
Exactly, and if you're worried about the quality of their ideas, you can always offer some prompts or examples to get them thinking more deeply. Remember, this is a collaborative process, and it's okay to guide and support them along the way.
That makes me feel a lot better.
Yeah.
It's not about expecting them to be rubric experts right out of the gate. It's about working together to create something meaningful and useful.
Precisely. And once you've got this awesome visual rubric co-created with your students, the next step is figuring out how to actually use it in your classroom.
Right, because we don't want this to be another one of the things that just sits on the shelf gathering dust.
Right.
We want it to be a living, breathing part of our classroom culture.
Absolutely. And thankfully, the chapter provides a very manageable approach, incorporating those rubrics into our daily routine through short, frequent check-ins.
Instead of those big formal evaluations that can feel so high pressure,
Yeah.
we're weaving those critical thinking skills into the everyday fabric of our teaching.
Exactly. The chapter suggests dedicating just 15 minutes every few lessons to focus on a specific competency. You might even choose one competency to emphasize each week, making it a consistent theme.
So, for example, this week could be Collaboration Week, where we're constantly referencing our co-created collaboration rubric and reflecting on how we're working together.
Exactly. You can have those mini reflections as a whole class in small groups or even individually. The key is to make it a regular part of your classroom practice.
And these check-ins don't have to be these intense sit-down evaluations.
No.
It's more about fostering awareness, providing feedback, encouraging students to self-assess.
Right. You might say something like, okay, everyone take a look at our collaboration rubric. Think about how you demonstrated those skills during today's group activity. Which part of the rubric do you think you really nailed? Which part are you still working on? What's one thing you could do differently next time?
I love that it's so simple yet so powerful. And by making those questions open-ended, you're inviting students to really reflect and think critically about their own learning process.
I have a question.
Wouldn't students get tired of constantly being evaluated, even if it's just these quick check-ins?
That's where that co-creation aspect is so crucial because they were involved in defining what good looks like.
Right.
They're more invested in the process. It's not the teacher imposing standards, it's a shared understanding of what we're all working towards.
So it becomes less about judgment and more about growth and improvement.
Precisely. And the chapter stresses that these rubrics aren't about assigning grades or labeling students.
Yeah.
They're about providing feedback that helps them develop those essential skills.
So it's less about you got this many points and more about here's what you did well and here's how you can keep getting better.
Exactly. And when students feel like their voices are heard and their progress is valued, they're more likely to be engaged and motivated to learn.
It all circles back to creating that positive classroom culture where thinking is celebrated. I'm so glad we dug into this idea of co-constructing rubrics. It's truly a game changer.
I agree. And the beauty of it is it's applicable to any grade level and any subject.
That's great.
It's about shifting our mindset about evaluation and focusing on what truly matters, those essential skills that will help our students thrive.
Before we move on, let's just recap what we've covered so far.
Okay.
We talked about co-creating rubrics with students, using a T-chart to brainstorm what good and not so good looks like for a specific competency.
Right.
Then we discussed transforming those ideas into a clear visual rubric.
Yes.
And finally, we talked about incorporating those rubrics into our daily routines through short, frequent check-ins.
It's a fantastic framework that puts student voices at the heart of the learning process.
Now, in the final part of this deep dive, we'll take a look at some real-world examples of these visual rubrics in action. We're back for the final part of our deep dive into Chapter 12. We've covered a lot of ground, haven't we?
We have, from limitations of traditional rubrics to the power of co-creating those with students and all those T-charts.
Yeah, and turning them into those visual masterpieces.
Exactly, but I think teachers really want to see now
Yeah.
is how this all comes together in the classroom.
You read my mind, the chapter does a great job
It does.
of providing some great examples of these visual rubrics in action.
Ew.
I think seeing those concrete examples will really click it all home.
Absolutely. One of the examples that stood out to me was the K1 collaboration rubric,
Okay.
shown in figure 12.3.
Oh, yeah.
It's incredibly simple, yet so effective,
Especially for younger learners.
especially for younger learners.
Yeah, I remember that one. It uses those adorable stick figure drawings
Yes.
to represent different levels of collaboration.
Right. On one end of the spectrum, you have stick figures working alone, looking a bit sad or frustrated. And on the other end, you see those stick figures happily working together, sharing ideas and solving problems as a team.
And in between, there are those simple images depicting behaviors like didn't share, argued, took turns talking.
Yeah.
All those little nuances of collaboration that can be hard to capture in words alone.
Exactly. And because it's so visual, even young children can understand that concept of moving along that continuum.
Uh-huh.
From less collaborative to more collaborative behaviors, it takes the abstract idea of collaboration and makes it tangible and relatable.
Yeah, it's like giving them a roadmap for success.
Yes.
Showing them what those different levels of collaboration look like in practice, not just telling them to be more collaborative without any real guidance.
Absolutely.
Would you say that's fair?
Absolutely. And one of the things I really appreciate about these visual rubrics
Yeah.
is how they shift the focus away from those rigid categories and labels.
Instead of trying to fit themselves into a specific box, meets expectations, needs improvement, they are seeing their progress as a continuous journey.
Precisely. It's not about being good or bad at collaborating. It's about understanding where they are on that spectrum
Right.
and identifying those next steps they can take to improve.
It really fosters a growth mindset, doesn't it?
It does.
Not just in math, but in all areas of learning.
In all areas of learning. And the chapter provides examples of how these rubrics can be adapted for other competencies as well, like perseverance and risk-taking. So it's not just a one-off strategy for collaboration. It's a framework that can be applied across the board.
That's what's so exciting about this approach. It's not a prescriptive program. It's a set of principles that can be tailored to fit your individual classroom.
Yeah.
Your students needs your own teaching style.
Right. It gives you that flexibility to make it your own, which is so important for teachers. Now, I know you had a question earlier
Yeah.
about how these rubrics are actually used
Right.
in terms of assessment.
The chapter does mention that they're observational in nature. So does that mean we're not actually grading students based on these rubrics?
That's correct. The primary purpose of these rubrics is to provide feedback and foster self-reflection. It's about helping students understand their own strengths and areas for growth, not about ranking them or comparing them to others.
Which makes sense because when we take the pressure off those high-stakes assessments, it allows students to really focus on the learning process itself. They're not so worried about getting the right answer or achieving a certain grade.
Exactly. And remember those frequent check-ins we talked about?
Yes.
Those become opportunities for students to use the rubric to reflect on their own progress and set goals for themselves.
So those check-ins aren't about the teacher judging or evaluating.
Right.
They're about guiding students to become more self-aware and take ownership of their learning.
Precisely. It's about creating that culture of continuous improvement where mistakes are seen as opportunities for growth, not failures.
I'm really starting to see how this approach could transform not just my math teaching,
Yes,
but my entire classroom environment.
I agree.
But I have to be honest, there's a part of me that's still feeling a bit overwhelmed by all this.
I understand it's a big shift in mindset, and it can feel like a lot to take on, especially when you're already juggling so much as a teacher.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So what advice would you give to teachers who are excited about this approach, but maybe feeling a bit hesitant to jump in?
The best advice I can give is to start small. Choose one competency that really resonates with you and your students, co-create a rubric together, and experiment with those short, frequent check-ins. See how it goes. Get feedback from your students and adjust your approach as needed.
That's really reassuring. It's not about overhauling everything overnight. It's about taking those small steps and finding what works best for you and your classroom.
Exactly. Be patient with yourself and with your students. This is a journey, and it's okay to make mistakes along the way. The important thing is to keep that focus on fostering those critical thinking skills that will benefit your students long after they leave your classroom.
This deep dive has been so insightful. It's
Yes.
really challenged me to rethink my approach to assessment and focus on what truly matters developing those lifelong learning skills.
I'm so glad to hear that. Remember, by shifting our focus from content mastery to those core competencies,
Right.
and by involving students in the process, we can create a learning environment where thinking is valued, celebrated, and nurtured.
And who knows, maybe we'll even inspire the next generation of mathematicians, scientists, and critical thinkers along the way.
I have no doubt about it. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Chapter 12. Until next time, keep those thinking caps on.